Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
They said it so casually, like it was just another Tuesday. It's just not in the budget, honey. That's what my mom said when I asked if they could help with college applications. I was 17. Quiet. Obedient. The kind of kid who emptied the dishwasher without being asked. But that day, I felt something crack. Like I'd just read the fine print on a contract I never signed. I was on my own. But I didn't cry. I watched. And I waited. I think the thing that stung the most wasn't even the words themselves, it was how easily they came out of her mouth, like she'd rehearsed them in front of the mirror while curling her hair. My mom, Carol, had a way of saying things that sounded final, like gospel truth, no room for debate, no cracks to squeeze any emotion into. She didn't even look up from her iPad when she said it, just kept scrolling through some home goods clearance site, her thumb flicking like she was trying to swipe me away too. I was standing there, transcript in hand, a brochure for the university folded in my back pocket, my heart beating in that awkward teenage rhythm of hope and dread mixed together. I had this tiny sliver of belief, stupid, really, that maybe, just maybe, if I showed them how serious I was, they'd be proud enough to help. They weren't mean people, at least not in the way you picture when someone says that. They didn't hit, didn't scream, didn't lock me in closets. But what they did, what they didn't do, sometimes felt worse. The kind of silence that eats away at your skin slowly. They just didn't see me. Not the real me. They saw chores done, lights off by 10, honor rolls posted on the fridge for exactly 1 week, and then quietly replaced with Jake's football schedule. I was background noise in my own life. Jake was the main event. 2 years younger, louder, messier, funnier, a natural spotlight magnet. He got in trouble every other week, weed in the glove box, dented mom's car, failed his sophomore English class twice, and yet, he was the center of the family portrait. They loved him like he was their last chance at being interesting. I was just there. The safe bet. The fallback. No one cheers for the kid who's doing fine. You just nod at them and move on. That afternoon, when Mom dropped the budget line like it was a recipe instruction, I felt something unhook in my chest. I didn't fight back. I didn't explain that the budget she referred to as the same one that had covered Jake's second football camp last summer, or the flat-screen TV Dad had mounted in the garage to watch the games in peace. I just stood there, nodded slowly, and let her words settle in my bones. A few hours later, I sat on the porch swing out back with my laptop open, rereading the college's financial aid page. Application fee, $85. Essay prompts, already written. Letters of recommendation, secured. All I needed was the money, just $85 damn dollars. But I knew then I'd never get it from them, not even if I begged. It wasn't about the budget. It was about where they saw value. And I wasn't where they were placing their bets. I remember looking at my hands resting on the laptop, fingers still trembling a little. I thought about how many dishwashers I'd emptied, how many Saturday mornings I spent cleaning Jake's room while he was too hungover to move. I thought about every time they told me I was so mature for my age and used that maturity as an excuse to stop parenting altogether. I was 17. I had one pair of decent jeans. And now I had to figure out how to leave. And here's where I want to ask something, not just to fill time, but because I think maybe someone watching this has lived it too. When did you realize your parents loved the idea of you, but not the real you? That they loved you in a general sense, like a neighbor or a pet, but not in the way that made them show up? Because that moment hit me like a freight train. They loved saying they had a daughter who's always doing well. They just didn't want to invest in what that actually meant. The next morning, Jake spilled orange juice across the kitchen floor. Mom laughed like it was the funniest thing in the world, like we were in some sitcom. "Oh, Jake," she said, already wiping it up, "you're a tornado, I swear." He grinned like a kid with a golden ticket, no consequences in sight. Dad was outside, probably polishing the grill he bought last month that hadn't been a budget issue either, by the way. That man had tools I'd never seen before, just sitting in drawers he never opened. He liked collecting things, just not moments. Not memories. Not me. I started tracking every unnecessary purchase after that day, silently, privately. The kind of passive revenge only the invisible child can fully commit to. New rugs for the den, $130. Jake's new video game chair, $200. A weekend trip to visit some family in Nashville, where I was explicitly not invited because you'll just be working anyway, sweetie. I watched it all build up like evidence, though I wasn't sure what court I'd ever present it to. Maybe just the future. Maybe just myself. A week later, I walked past the kitchen and overheard Dad saying something about planning a little something for Jake's birthday. He was turning 18 in a month. I paused just long enough to hear Mom respond, "Yeah, I think he's gonna love the surprise." I mean, if anyone deserves it. Her voice trailed off as I rounded the corner. I knew then. I knew exactly what was coming. And that's when the slow burn inside me started to turn into something sharper. Something colder. Not rage. Not jealousy. Something else. A plan. Because if they were going to act like I didn't exist, like I was just a tax deduction with a pulse, then I would give them exactly what they wanted. I'd vanish so cleanly they wouldn't even have a chance to miss me. They wanted a quiet daughter? They were about to get one. The kind of quiet that echoes. It was one of those early April Saturdays where the sun came out just long enough to fool you into thinking spring had finally arrived, only for the wind to cut through your sweatshirt like a warning not to get too comfortable, and I remember that morning so clearly. Not because anything felt particularly off, but because it started exactly the way my life always had, quietly, predictably, and entirely uncentered around me. I had picked up an extra morning shift at Annie's Diner, a job I'd kept for nearly 2 years without missing a single day, serving eggs and pouring coffee for the kind of locals who thought remembering your name was a generous act of community. The morning rush had come and gone, and since Marcy showed up an hour early to flirt with the cook, I took the chance to clock out and head home. Looking forward to nothing more than peeling off my grease-stained polo shirt and maybe catching a nap before tackling my calculus homework. But the moment I turned onto our street, I knew something was off, not dramatically off, but just skewed enough to make my stomach tighten. There were too many cars parked along the curb, too many folding chairs unfolding themselves across our lawn, and from half a block away I could already hear the bass-heavy pulse of Jake's favorite playlist thumping through the open windows. Balloons were tied to our mailbox, black and red, our high school colors, and I spotted Mrs. Caldwell from church setting a tray of deviled eggs on the plastic table we only ever dragged out for birthdays or family barbecues. At first, for a split second, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, they'd decided to surprise me with something. It was stupid, I know, delusional even, but hope doesn't die easily, even after years of starvation. I pulled into the driveway behind Mom's minivan and sat there with the engine idling, trying to figure out what the hell was going on. And then I saw it, the truck. Shiny, brand new, black as tar with chrome accents that caught the sunlight like a movie reveal. A red bow sat squarely across the hood, the kind you only ever see in car commercials, and for a moment I thought maybe I had fallen asleep behind the wheel, and this was some cruel fever dream my brain had cooked up just to mess with me. But no, it was real, painfully real. And standing next to it, grinning like he'd just been handed the keys to manhood itself, was Jake, our family's chosen one, surrounded by half the football team, 2 of his ex-girlfriends, and our parents, who looked like they'd just won the lottery. My mom was dressed in her casual fancy clothes, white capris and a pastel blouse she only wore when she wanted the neighbors to think we had our lives together. And she was clapping as Dad held out the keys like he was knighting Jake into some sacred brotherhood of American manhood. 18 years, buddy, Dad said, his voice booming across the crowd like some proud general. You've earned it. And just like that, the last thread holding me to that family snapped so silently that no one even noticed. I stepped out of my car, closed the door without slamming it, and walked through the front door of the house like a ghost moving through a party she hadn't been invited to. Inside, the noise was muffled, the house oddly untouched by the chaos outside, and I moved slowly, deliberately, past the photos lining the hallway, Jake in his football uniform, Jake at Disney World, Jake and Mom in matching Christmas pajamas, until I reached my room and closed the door with a soft click that somehow felt louder than all the voices outside. I sat on the edge of my bed, still in my work clothes, and stared out the window at the celebration unfolding just beyond the glass. I watched my dad hoist a beer and slap Jake on the back, heard the music swell into some anthem about freedom and horsepower, and realized with total clarity that they would never see me the way they saw him. Not because I wasn't worthy, but because they had never learned how to look for value in silence, in discipline, in someone who doesn't demand attention but deserves it anyway. I don't remember crying, not really. There were a few tears, maybe, but it wasn't sadness, it was something else. Something heavier. A kind of acceptance that leaves you hollow at first, like someone cut out a piece of you and filled it with cement. I looked over at the stack of college brochures I kept hidden in my desk drawer, all of them dog-eared and highlighted, full of campuses I'd never seen and futures I'd built in my head, and I felt the weight of every choice I'd ever made not to rock the boat. And for what? So they could ignore me more peacefully? That night, after the party had died down and Jake was out back showing off his truck's Bluetooth to some girl named Amber, I crept into the kitchen, phone in hand, and opened up my email. I removed my parents' names from the financial aid section of my college application. I unchecked the box that said considered dependent, and I began the long, tedious process of proving what I had known deep in my bones for years, that I was on my own. And weirdly, it felt good. Not freeing exactly, but clarifying. Like I had finally stopped waiting for them to become the parents I needed, and started becoming the person I'd have to be instead. Upstairs, I could hear my mom laughing at something Jake said, her voice high and carefree, untouched by guilt or reflection, and I realized that nothing I could ever do would change how they measured love. They had made their investment. The truck was just a symbol of what they thought mattered, a declaration of belief in their son's future. And me? I was the afterthought, the footnote, the fine print at the bottom of the family portrait. But I wasn't angry. Not anymore. I was focused. Something inside me had shifted, not just emotionally, but structurally, like a house settling after a storm. I started thinking less about what they owed me and more about what I owed myself. I would go to college. I would leave this town. I would become someone they'd only recognize when it was too late to matter. And when that day came, because I knew it would, I would not let them rewrite the story. I would not let them take credit for a single step I took. Because if they couldn't see me now, they didn't deserve to find me later. I turned off the lights, closed my laptop, and lay down on my bed, the laughter from downstairs fading into silence. Somewhere in that quiet, I made a promise. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove to myself that I had always been right to want more. There's something almost sacred about doing things in silence, especially when you've spent your entire life being spoken over, brushed aside, or simply looked through like you're nothing more than a smudge on the edge of someone else's spotlight. And when I tell you that I didn't breathe a word to my parents about the scholarship, not even a whisper, not even a stray sigh that might hint at excitement or relief, it's not because I wanted to be dramatic or cruel, but because I had finally understood the kind of power that comes from keeping things for yourself when the world has taught you that everything you feel must be justified, explained, and then ignored anyway. It was a gray, damp Thursday afternoon when the envelope arrived, thick, glossy, heavier than the usual college mailers I'd been getting for months, and as I pulled it from our beat-up mailbox with its loose hinge and fading red flag, I could already feel in my bones that this was the one that mattered. I remember standing at the edge of the driveway, fingers frozen from the wind, tearing it open with a kind of cautious desperation that only comes from years of trying not to hope too hard. The words jumped off the page before I even finished reading the first paragraph: full academic scholarship, renewable for 4 years, room and board included, with an invitation to the university's honors program and an optional summer program for early arrival and transition support. It was, quite literally, everything I needed and more than I had dared ask for. But what I felt in that moment wasn't elation or gratitude, at least not in the way you might expect. It was quiet, calm, like the ocean just after a storm, still heavy with tension but strangely beautiful in its stillness. I didn't run into the house waving the letter, didn't call my mom at work or wait for Dad to come home so I could finally have my look at me now moment. I walked inside, folded the letter neatly, and placed it in the back of my closet under the stack of sweatshirts I never wore. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, finished my calculus homework, and made dinner, Pasta with frozen meatballs, Jake's favorite, though he barely touched it before heading out to meet the guys. That was the thing about our house. Things that mattered to me never made it past the threshold of acknowledgement, while things that barely scratched the surface of importance for Jake were treated like state affairs. When he scraped together a barely passing grade in chemistry, it was cause for pizza and a "we're so proud" toast. When I brought home a certificate for academic excellence, it ended up buried under the pile of coupons and junk mail on the kitchen counter. At some point, I stopped putting them out altogether, and no one noticed. In the weeks that followed, I built my escape like a secret mission, careful, methodical, determined not to tip my hand too soon. I set up a student account at a credit union 3 towns over, started transferring small amounts from my diner tips into savings, and researched what I'd need to live in a dorm. I spoke to Mrs. Greer, the only adult in my life who ever looked at me like I was more than a placeholder, and she helped me file paperwork for housing, filled out the FAFSA confirmation, and walked me through what to expect when I arrived in August. She never asked why I didn't tell my parents. I think she already knew. At school, whispers started to spread. Teachers would smile at me in the hallway with a kind of quiet recognition, and once or twice I heard someone mention Lena's going places under their breath in the staff lounge as I passed. Jake, of course, had no idea. He was too busy being the hero of his own mediocre movie, rolling up to school in his gleaming truck, blasting music loud enough to shake lockers, nodding at teachers who, in all fairness, had long since stopped pretending he was anything more than a disruption with a charming smile. It was in late May when I knew the truth of what I was doing had finally settled into something real. I was sitting on the back porch, barefoot, knees pulled up to my chest, the scholarship letter now slightly worn at the edges from all the times I had unfolded and read it under the cover of darkness. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the occasional laughter from Jake's room, where he and a few friends were apparently watching some action movie for the 3rd time that week. My parents were out, some date night to rekindle the spark, as Mom always joked, and I was alone, which, honestly, had become my preferred state of being. I didn't want them to know. Not now. Not ever, really. Because if they couldn't be bothered to believe in me without a certificate to prove it, then they didn't deserve the satisfaction of seeing what I'd made of myself. Still, silence has a weight to it. Not all of it is empowering. There were nights I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I was doing the right thing, wondering if maybe I was being petty or unfair or cold, but those thoughts always crumbled beneath the memory of every time I had asked for something small, a ride, a book, a simple moment of attention, and been met with shrugs or sighs or worse, a well-meaning lecture about how Jake really needs us right now. It was always Jake. And I had grown tired of being the emotional leftovers. Senior awards night arrived before I had fully prepared myself for what it might mean to be recognized publicly when the people who were supposed to cheer for you didn't even know you were playing the game. I wore a plain black dress I'd found at the Goodwill in the next county and did my makeup in the school bathroom because I didn't want to answer any questions about where I was going or why I looked fancier than usual. The auditorium buzzed with energy, families clapping, teachers beaming, students shifting nervously in their seats, and I sat alone, hands folded in my lap, heart steady in a way that surprised me. When they called my name, there was a pause in the crowd, not because people didn't know me, but because they hadn't expected it. I walked to the stage, accepted my awards, plural, which shocked even me, and smiled politely for the cameras. I didn't scan the crowd. I didn't search for my parents' faces, because I already knew they weren't there. They had tickets to some community theater play Jake's girlfriend was in, and they'd forgotten about the ceremony entirely. And in that moment, standing on the stage with the weight of the certificate in my hand and the warmth of the spotlight on my face, I didn't feel sad. I felt free. Because when you stop needing people to see you in order to know you exist, you become something entirely different, someone who writes their own story, signs their own name, and refuses to be anyone's footnote ever again. There are certain days in your life when everything that's been slowly, silently brewing beneath the surface, every ignored plea, every invisible victory, every swallowed disappointment that settled like concrete in your chest, suddenly rises all at once, Not in a wave of rage or chaos, but with a terrifying kind of clarity, the kind that slices through all the noise and leaves behind nothing but truth so sharp it almost feels clean. For me, that day was graduation, the long-anticipated conclusion to 12 years of being the reliable, invisible daughter, the quiet achiever who never caused a scene, who never needed to be reminded to do her homework or clean her room or keep her voice down because she had learned early that being good meant being small, and being small meant being left alone. But not that day. Not anymore. Graduation day came with the kind of heat that makes polyester gowns feel like punishment, and as I walked into the gymnasium-turned-auditorium with my cap pinned carefully over the curls I'd let loose for the first time in forever, I wasn't thinking about tassels or photos or even the absurdity of Jake complaining about how long the ceremony would be, despite the fact that he'd done absolutely nothing to earn his place in the stands. I was thinking about what I had planned, what I had spent weeks preparing without telling a soul except Mrs. Greer, who had helped me piece together something I wasn't even sure I was allowed to want, a moment of truth, spoken out loud, with no room for interruptions. They were late. Of course, they were. My parents strolled in 15 minutes after the auditorium had already begun filling, dressed like they were heading to Sunday brunch, Dad in his short-sleeved button-up and Mom in a wrinkled sundress that still had a tag sticking out the back. Both of them scanning the room with that distracted look of people searching for someone they assume is waiting to be found. I saw them from my seat near the front, tucked behind the reserved section for honor graduates, and I didn't wave or call out or even flinch when I realized they were clearly surprised by how close to the stage I was. They had assumed, if they thought about it at all, that I'd be somewhere in the middle, maybe standing when my name was called, maybe not. They hadn't asked about awards. They hadn't asked about anything. They never had. But what they didn't know, what most of the room didn't know, and what I had arranged in secret, fueled by years of being overlooked, was that this graduation would not go exactly the way they expected. I hadn't planned a tantrum or a confrontation or even a tearful speech meant to shame them into guilt. That wasn't my style. Instead, I had offered Mrs. Greer an idea, just a small suggestion that the school's pre-diploma slideshow could use a voiceover, something that gave texture to the photos, something personal and reflective. It wasn't unusual, plenty of schools did it. But what I provided wasn't a speech. It was a recording. My voice. My story. Spliced carefully between the smiling snapshots and posed group shots of graduates in their matching gowns, synced perfectly with the image that mattered most. As the lights dimmed and the music softened, the screen flickered to life. There was the typical background music, the predictable slideshow of childhood photos, field trips, spirit weeks, and sports games. People laughed and clapped and pointed as their kids' faces flashed across the screen. Then it happened. The slide changed, and suddenly the music faded down. My voice, calm but undeniable, filled the room. I was never the loudest. I was never the one they waited up for or bragged about at dinner parties. I never crashed a car or missed curfew. I kept my head down. I followed the rules. I said thank you when I got leftovers and sorry when it wasn't my fault. I waited. I watched. And while no one was looking, I built a life that wasn't handed to me. I earned every step with no applause. And I did it alone. The silence in the auditorium was suffocating. People turned in their seats, some confused, others frozen. My face appeared on the screen, not in a posed senior photo, but in a candid shot Mrs. Greer had taken months earlier, me sitting in the library, focused, unaware, real. It lingered there as the last words echoed out. No one noticed. I did it anyway. The screen faded to black, and the next graduate's photo resumed as if nothing had happened. But everything had changed. You could feel it in the air, in the way people whispered and leaned over to each other. Some clapped. Others just stared. And then the principal called my name. Lena Ray Mitchell. Honors graduate, full academic scholarship, recipient of the Greer Award for Independent Excellence. The crowd applauded, maybe louder than before, or maybe it just felt that way because I could finally hear it without all the noise of pretending. But I wasn't there. Not in my seat. Not in the row they had expected me to rise from. I had slipped out 10 minutes before, just as the slideshow began, exiting through the side hallway with my diploma already in hand, thanks to Mrs. Greer's careful coordination. I didn't want their clapping. I didn't want their photo. I didn't want to give them the chance to turn my work into their pride. Outside, the heat had given way to a slow breeze, and I stood under the shadow of the big oak tree near the parking lot, the same tree I used to sit beneath during lunch on days when the cafeteria felt too loud to survive. I watched through the glass as my parents stood in confusion, scanning the crowd, their heads turning from left to right, their hands shielding their eyes from the stage lights as they tried to spot me. Jake, in his sunglasses and untucked shirt, looked vaguely annoyed, checking his phone instead of asking questions. And for a brief, surreal moment, I realized they weren't just looking for me physically, they were trying to locate something they had never taken the time to truly see. I turned away before they could come outside. I didn't need the confrontation. I didn't need the closure. I had already given myself everything I needed. In my hand was the diploma, the scholarship confirmation folded neatly in my purse, and my dorm key dangling on a lanyard around my neck. I wasn't waiting for permission anymore. I wasn't waiting for applause. I was done waiting. As I walked toward my car, parked in the farthest corner of the lot, far from the rows my father had insisted were for important guests, I felt something settle in me, a kind of quiet pride I had never known, not the shallow warmth of approval, but the deep, anchored knowledge that I had taken back something they never realized they stole. My story, my voice, my moment. And somewhere, back inside that building, they kept looking. But they couldn't find me. Not that day. Not ever again in the way they used to. Because I wasn't hiding anymore. I had simply chosen to go where they couldn't follow. There's a strange kind of silence that follows a moment of truth, not the absence of sound. Not the kind you get when a room empties or a conversation dies, but the kind that lingers after a revelation, heavy and dense like the air before a storm. Where everyone pretends things are still normal even though the walls have already started shifting, even though the foundation has already cracked. That's the kind of silence that settled in the days following graduation, a silence that belonged not to me anymore, but to the people who had finally started to realize they had missed something. Something big, something permanent. And the most bitter part of it, the irony so sharp it almost made me laugh, was that when they finally looked for me, when they finally wanted to understand not just where I had gone, but who I had become, it wasn't out of love or pride or regret. It was out of embarrassment, out of shame, out of a sudden, urgent need to rewrite the story before anyone else wrote it for them. The morning after graduation, I woke up in a dorm room that still smelled like fresh paint and new carpet glue, my mattress still wrapped in plastic, my bag unpacked, my future quiet and untouched and mine. I opened my phone to dozens of messages, some from classmates I barely spoke to, some from teachers who had sat in that auditorium and heard my voice come through the speakers with a calm they hadn't expected, and some from people I hadn't spoken to in years, who now wanted to say they always knew I was going places, that they were so proud of what I'd done. There were even a few posts on Facebook. One girl had recorded the slideshow, including the part where my voice came through, and it had already started making rounds in our small town circle. There were comments underneath, most supportive, a few confused, and at least one that asked the question I had hoped someone would ask: where were her parents? It didn't take long. By lunchtime, I saw my mother's name pop up on my caller ID. I let it ring. I watched the screen light up, then go dark, then light up again with a message. Then another. Then a text. Lena, call me. We're confused. We want to talk. We didn't know. Please. A few hours later, Dad tried, not a call, of course, but a single, clumsy message. You should have said something. And that right there, that sentence, those 5 hollow words, told me everything I needed to know. Because I had said something. I had said something every day for years, just not with words they were willing to hear. Every moment I showed up, did the work, kept my head down while Jake got celebrated for breathing, that was me saying something. Every quiet dinner, every unacknowledged award, every time I watched them choose him and tell me it was just different with boys, that was me saying something. They just didn't listen. And now that other people were listening, they were panicking. The next day, Jake posted something on Instagram that made its way back to me through the usual grapevine. A photo of him leaning against his truck, captioned with, "Some people love attention more than their own family." Sad. No name. No tag. But we all knew who it was meant for. It didn't bother me. Not in the way it used to. Not in the way it might have when I was 16 and still hoping he'd grow up enough to see me as more than competition for the spotlight. Because by now, I had learned that people like Jake, people raised to believe the world owed them love just for existing, don't know what to do with someone who earned it. They get defensive. They lash out. They hide behind smug little captions and wait for the applause. But I wasn't clapping anymore. And I wasn't explaining myself either. I posted only one thing that week. A photo of my dorm room, simple, undecorated, lit by late afternoon sun, with my nameplate visible on the desk and my scholarship binder open next to it. No face. No caption. Just the proof. Just the reality. And within hours, I had messages from people I barely remembered from high school, asking how I did it, asking if I could help their little sister with her application, asking if I'd speak to the community center's mentoring group in the fall. Suddenly, the girl who was never invited to the party had become the one they were quoting. And my parents? They weren't saying much anymore. Because now, saying something meant admitting they had never noticed. And they weren't ready to do that. A week later, on a humid July afternoon that made the dorm AC struggle to keep up, I looked out my window and saw my mother's car pull into the faculty lot behind the student center. She got out slowly, dressed in something too formal for the heat, holding her purse like a shield. She didn't see me watching her from above, didn't know that I had already anticipated this moment, already rehearsed every possible outcome. I waited as she approached the front desk, asked the RA for my room number, and was told she'd need to leave a message instead. I watched her write something down on a slip of paper, her handwriting slow, unfamiliar in the distance, and hand it over before walking back to her car with that same fragile posture she always used when things didn't go her way. I didn't go down. I didn't chase her. And I didn't call later to ask what she'd written, because I didn't need to. Whatever it was, it wouldn't be enough. Not anymore. Because forgiveness, real forgiveness, doesn't come from a surprise visit or a sad look in the hallway. It comes from work. From showing up when it's hard. From loving someone before the crowd tells you to. And they hadn't done that. Not once. There's this myth we're told, especially as daughters, that if we're quiet enough and good enough and patient enough, love will eventually find us in the form we deserve. That parents will come around. That the moment they see us succeed, they'll finally understand. But what no one tells you is that sometimes they don't. Sometimes they only want to show up for the photo, not the journey. Sometimes they only love you when other people do first. And so, as the sun dipped low over the campus and the first fireflies began their silent blinking ballet, I sat on the windowsill of a room I had earned, in a place they had no part in building, and I felt not anger, not vengeance, but peace. Because in the end, I didn't need them to find me. Everyone else already had. And more importantly, I had finally found myself.